This is BBC World News America. Reporting from Washington, I'm Rajini Vaidyanathan. In just hours, the US government shutdown will become the longest in history. For those impacted, it can't end soon enough.
Guess what? I don't need a damn wall. I need my money today.
The US begins withdrawing military equipment from Syria, creating more confusion over American policy on the pullout.
Andy, does that mean that this might be your last tournament?
And an emotional Andy Murray announces his retirement. For the British tennis star, pain is putting an end to his impressive play. Welcome to our viewers on public television in America and around the globe. We're now 21 days into the partial government shutdown, and a painful impact is now being felt. Today, hundreds of thousands of federal workers didn't receive a paycheck. And with President Trump saying he's not ready to declare a national emergency, there isn't a resolution in sight. The only thing for certain is that this will soon become the longest shutdown in American history. The BBC's Nick Bryant reports.
Harvest time in the fields of Virginia, where farmers hit already by the trade war with Beijing are now feeling the bite of the political war in Washington. John Boyd Jr. has been receiving federal subsidies to compensate for not being able to export his soybean crops to China, a financial lifeline during difficult times, severed because of the shutdown.
Guess what? I don't need a damn wall. I need my money today. I need my money to plant my crop. I need my money to pay my labor. I need my money to continue my farming operation.
Federal workers have mounted protests across the country, and today was supposed to be payday. But on social media, employees posted pay slips showing they hadn't received a single dollar.
A lot of things are working out well.
To break the political deadlock, this billionaire president has warned he'll declare a national emergency. But he's not ready to take that extraordinary step yet.
It's the easy way out, but Congress should do this. This is too simple. It's too basic. And Congress should do this. If they can't do it, if at some point they just can't do it, this is a 15-minute meeting. If they can't do it, I will declare a national emergency.
Invoking emergency powers could end the shutdown because it would allow Congress to pass spending bills without funding for the wall that Democrats and Republicans could both support. But the Trump White House would be violating the norms of US government by spending money on the barrier without congressional approval. This constitutional showdown would inevitably be settled in the courts. But in the meantime, federal employees could return to work.
Heavenly Father, we thank you for this time. We pray today for your wisdom, for your answers, for your help in the time of crisis.
Tonight at the White House, they prayed for this norm-busting president. But for now, he's paying reverence to more earthly powers, the checks and balances of the U.S. Constitution.
Thank you, Pastor, very much. I appreciate it. It's beautiful.
Nick Bryant, BBC News, Washington.
Well, for more on the next move in this standoff, I spoke a brief while ago with Aisha, Roscoe, White House reporter for National Public Radio. We saw in that report there a farmer saying, I need my money today. Hundreds of thousands of Americans not getting a paycheck. How does this change the ongoing standoff?
Well, I think it gets to this kind of practical problem for the president and for Democrats and Republicans in Congress is that people right now they're working and they're not getting paid, or they're at home and they're not getting paid. And then you have all these other people who are relying on the government, whether it's for loans if you're a farmer or for other things, and they are not getting that help and that assistance that they depend on. And so those are the people that are going to be putting pressure on this White House and on Congress to act to do something.
We've heard from President Trump today that he is not going to declare a national emergency. He says, I'm not looking to do it right now. Why won't he do it right now?
It's not really clear, and it's not clear how long that will last. the White House has been kind of all over the place when it comes to this idea of a national emergency. They've been saying that it's on the table, but they haven't provided any timelines. And even just yesterday, it sounded like President Trump was saying that he wasn't going to wait very long, and that if he didn't get a compromise, he'd go ahead and do it. And then today, he says that he's not ready to do it yet. So that really is the question. It seems like what the White House would like to see is that the shutdown would kind of put pressure on Democrats, that they would see the pain that is happening with federal workers, and that they would then somehow come to the table and just give some money for a barrier or for a wall. But that just doesn't seem to be happening. And what Democrats will say is they don't feel that they need to do that because the president said that Mexico would pay for the wall.
Yes, and we've heard from Nancy Pelosi, the leader of the Democratic House, who is saying that she's waiting for the president to act next. I mean, what could the Democratic strategy be going forward?
Well, their strategy seems to be that they're going to try to press the issue in the House. They're going to continue to pass bills that would open up other departments that aren't Department of Homeland Security, and then basically kind of say, we're working, we're saying open up the government, and then give us time to deal with this issue of the Department of Homeland Security. Let people get back to work while we're debating. And so basically they're going to continue to spread that message. Of course, the Senate has, in the Senate, Mitch McConnell, Senate Majority Leader Mitch McConnell has said that's going nowhere. He will only sign what the president will sign, and the White House says they will not deal with opening the government in a kind of piecemeal fashion. So you just have this impasse.
And as this drags on to potentially the longest shutdown in American history, who do you think is going to be blamed more?
That is the million-dollar question. If you ask Democrats, I'm sure that right now it seems like they think the president is going to be blamed more. The White House is putting all the emphasis on Democrats. That's kind of the spin game right now. Who can you pin the blame on and say both sides are saying the other side is unwilling to negotiate? But ultimately, it just seems that that people are, and when you look at the polling, they're just not pleased with this shutdown. They believe that it shouldn't be happening and that it's an embarrassment to the country that it's happening. And I don't know who is exactly winning the spin war, but that's what, but right now, people are not pleased with the way the government is running.
And just very briefly, Aisha, when do you think, and I know it's an impossible one to guess, when do you think this shutdown might be resolved?
I cannot even make a guess right now because neither side, both sides are kind of dug in right now. So it really is not clear when this will end.
Aisha, Roscoe, thank you. Now let's take a look at some of the day's other news. A 13-year-old girl from Wisconsin who went missing 3 months ago after her parents were murdered has been found alive. Police say Jamie Kloss, whose parents were discovered shot dead in their family home, was located on Thursday evening. A 21-year-old man's been charged with the crimes. The daughter of singer R. Kelly's broken her silence about the sexual abuse allegations surrounding her estranged father. On Instagram, 20-year-old Buku Abi wrote she was devastated, describing R. Kelly as a monster and a terrible father. He denies all allegations against him. Today, Pentagon officials confirmed that the US military's begun its withdrawal from Syria, removing some of its equipment. It comes just days after the president's national security advisor said that the pullout was conditional on certain terms being met on the ground, leaving many confused as to what US policy is. Well, a brief time ago, I spoke about today's move with Derek Chollet, a former Assistant Secretary of Defense who's now at the German Marshall Fund. Derek Chollet, thanks very much for coming in. We've heard today that the process of withdrawing equipment from Syria has begun, but not troops yet. What do you make of today's announcement?
Well, the stated U.S. policy is to withdraw from Syria. This week there has been a lot of confusing messages coming from the National Security Advisor, the Secretary of State, about whether or not we're staying in Syria. President Trump's made very clear that we're pulling out. The pace of that withdrawal and the contours of that withdrawal are still being determined. I think what we've seen today is an indication that the president's order will be implemented. The U.S. will begin to withdraw from Syria. The timing and the exact end game is still to be determined.
You've worked at the Pentagon, Assistant Secretary of Defense. Is it typical to withdraw equipment, then troops? How does that work?
Sure. I mean, the U.S. has a fairly significant presence in Syria, 2,000 troops. That requires a lot of equipment to support them, and also, of course, the capability that they brought with them to both train the Kurds and protect themselves and fight ISIS. So there's a lot that needs to get moved out. It makes sense to start that. I think what's so newsworthy about this is it comes on the heels of just yesterday, Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, saying that the U.S. is going to stay in Syria until every last Iranian boot is out. Well, it's pretty clear that President Trump's order will be implemented and the U.S. will be getting out of Syria.
And you mentioned a lot of mixed messages there, different message from the Secretary of State, but also from National Security Advisor John Bolton, who said that the withdrawal had to be conditional.
That's right. Well, again, it's unfortunately in the Syria story from the beginning of right before the holidays when the president made this abrupt announcement that we would be withdrawing from Syria, which of course led to Secretary Mattis's resignation as Secretary of Defense. This administration is not coherent in any way on its Syria policy in terms of the messaging. However, I believe that what we're seeing today indicates that the president's will has not changed. In other words, the order remains that the U.S. will be getting out of Syria.
And so, as someone who has insight to the DOD, what do you think officials there will be thinking today?
Well, I think officials there are probably believing that they're implementing the orders that were given to them, which is to begin the withdrawal. They probably, like many of us, are trying to understand what exactly is happening in the Middle East, as the National Security Advisor is saying it's going to be a conditions-based withdrawal. But nevertheless, at the beginning of this process, the timing shouldn't surprise us. I think the question that will remain is how fast will this be? Over what period of time will this withdrawal occur? Will any troops be left behind? If we don't have 2,000 there, could we leave several hundred behind? As well as what fills the gap that these troops are going to leave. And that apparently is what Secretary of State Pompeo is going to be talking about with our partners in the region this weekend.
So still lots of confusion.
Absolutely.
Derek Chalet, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
You're watching BBC World News America. Still to come on tonight's programme. A homeless community in Manila is making a living by running an unofficial rail line, but the trip comes with some real dangers. A court in Myanmar has rejected the appeal of two Reuters journalists who were jailed for 7 years for collecting state secrets. Wa Lone and Chaw So-u were convicted in September after reporting on a massacre of Rohingya Muslims by the army. Jonathan Head reports.
Myanmar's courts have proved themselves unsympathetic to the plight of the two Reuters journalists. That didn't change today. The judge rejected their appeal, stating that their 7-year prison sentence was, in his words, suitable punishment. For Chit Soo Win and Pane Mon, the wives of the two men, there was inevitable sadness over the verdict after nearly 400 days in custody. Their employer has campaigned hard for their release. That campaign will have to continue. Wa Lone and Chaw So-u were arrested in December 2017 and charged with violating the Official Secrets Act. They'd been investigating a massacre of Rohingyas by the security forces. The journalists said they were handed documents by the police that they didn't even read before they were arrested. Their account was backed by one of the police officers, who testified that they were deliberately set up to silence them. Worldwide outrage over their sentences, though, has not moved Aung San Suu Kyi, the country's de facto leader, who insists their convictions were justified.
We now feel that it is for the President of Myanmar to correct the injustice that is made, and the European Union repeats that we call for these journalists to be released immediately.
Those calls for their release have been made many times by many governments over the past year. Myanmar's international image has been further tarnished. Yet there's not been the smallest hint of leniency. Jonathan Head, BBC News, Bangkok.
In the Philippines, an unofficial rail car service is filling in the many gaps in Manila's struggling transport network. Commuters travel along the tracks on cars pushed by homeless people. And if that didn't sound dangerous enough, those tracks are still being used by active trains. It can be a deadly business, as the BBC's Howard Johnson reports.
This is Manila's unofficial rail service. It's run by a small homeless community that live by the tracks. Each trolley carries around 8 passengers. Joel Vejerano has been pushing trolleys for more than a decade. She earns around $10 a day.
At the start, it's push and run, push and run. If it's uphill and the trolley is full and you're the only one pushing, it's difficult. Our life here is, if you don't push, you don't eat.
It costs around 2 cents to travel around a kilometre on these tracks, and commuters like it because it's cheaper and more efficient than other forms of transport. But using it does come with risks. And that's because the line is still active. Around 4 trains pass along these tracks every hour. The Pandacan Bridge is the most dangerous part of the route. If a trolley is on the bridge as a train approaches, pushers must move to the other side as quickly as possible. The alternative is a 30-metre drop to the river below.
It feels disconcerting and scary when a train passes by. We don't know if we are shaking because of how loud the horns are or the rumble of the wheels. Last month, a train driver kept blowing his horn, but he hit a trolley pusher. Even his heart came out of his body. The pusher died.
The rail authorities say because the problem rests with a lack of law enforcement in the area, there's very little they can do.
Our drivers are really religiously observing our speed restrictions. We are requesting the full cooperation of the riders also, not to patronize the rail skates, because it's really risky, and pose dangers to the lives of everyone.
Lack of investment led to the decline of the country's rail service. Current President Rodrigo Duterte has promised to change that by spending on major rail infrastructure projects. But while a shortfall in service remains, trolley pushers will continue to plug the gaps. Howard Johnson, BBC News, Manila.
It's humbling to see the risks that Joel takes every day, but in her own words, she said, if you don't push, you don't eat. Now, British tennis star Andy Murray broke down in tears today as he announced that he'll be retiring from tennis this year. The 31-year-old's been struggling to recover from hip surgery 12 months ago and says that even basic things like putting on socks and shoes are causing him severe pain. The 3-time Grand Slam winner wants to compete for a final time at Wimbledon this summer, but he recognised that next week's Australian Open could be his final tournament. Patrick Geary reports.
Andy Murray would have wanted this press conference to be about his return and recovery. His body was telling him otherwise. One of the sport's steeliest characters forced to take a break from the questions. He came back, he always does, and was asked if the Australian Open might be his last tournament.
Yeah, I think there's a chance of that, yeah, for sure. Yeah, there's a chance of that for sure because, yeah, like I said, I'm not sure. I'm not sure I'm able to play through the pain, for another 4 or 5 months.
That pain, caused by the incredible exertion he's put himself through, has been with him for some time. The problems with his hip obvious at Wimbledon in 2017. After surgery, he tried to come back to tennis, but here finally was his limit.
Been struggling for a long time. I've been in a lot of pain for, it's been probably about 20 months now. I've pretty much done everything that I could to try and get my hip feeling better.
His body had carried him so far. From the young boy in Dunblane, marked out from the rest, to winning the US Open and shouldering the burden of being Britain's great Wimbledon hope. And then that moment in July 2013.
The waiting is over.
After 77 years, a British man had won Wimbledon. Murray won it again 3 years later, the same year he won his second Olympic gold medal. All achieved in perhaps tennis's toughest era, supermen with extraordinary powers. It's strange to be reminded they're human. But by last year, Murray knew the end was coming. He wants it to be on the grass courts where he made history.
I said to my team, look, I think I can kind of get through this until Wimbledon. That is where I would like to. That's where I would like to stop playing. But I'm also not certain I'm able to do that.
Murray's plan may succumb to the pain. One of Britain's greatest sportsmen will summon the energy to play Roberto Bautista Agut next week in Melbourne. It may be the last time we see him on a tennis court. Patrick Geary, BBC News.
Well, a brief time ago I spoke about Andy Murray's career with Sean Gregory, who covers sport for Time magazine. Sean Gregory, thanks for joining us. It was an emotional press conference there from Andy Murray. How much of a surprise was it?
It was pretty surprising. You know, he had been struggling with injuries and, you know, has been on the downside a little bit. But to suddenly say this might be it, I don't think anybody was ready for that. There's been this great rivalry in tennis with Roger Federer, Rafael Nadal, Novak Djokovic, and Andy Murray made it a big four. And those other guys are still going at it. And to see Andy say, this might be his last tournament, at the very best, Wimbledon's going to be his last tournament, you know, there's a sense of sadness, I think, in the tennis community.
You mentioned Wimbledon there. Of course, that, in many ways, certainly to Brits like me, defined his career. Just remind our viewers how he really transformed British success at Wimbledon.
He really did. You know, remember, go back, he won the tournament in 2013, becoming the first player from Great Britain to win Wimbledon in 77 years. But I think back to the 2012 Wimbledon final when he lost to Roger Federer, and he broke down in tears, and he cried, and it just, his emotions were on his sleeve. He basically said, I'm sorry, I did my best. And I think a lot of people, maybe outside of Great Britain, kind of fell in love with him and started rooting for the guy. He was an underdog. And then not about a month later in London at the same venue, he wins the gold medal in the Olympics, in the 2012 Olympics for Great Britain, beating Roger Federer at Wimbledon. And then the next year, he finally wins Wimbledon. He won the US Open in 2012, won 3 majors in his career, won Wimbledon again in 2016, so had a really, really distinguished career. And what he did on the world stage in the London Olympics and at Wimbledon really lifted Great Britain, which had been struggling in tennis for a long time.
We certainly were struggling in tennis. Now, tributes have been pouring in to Andy Murray in his career. Billie Jean King describing him as a champion on and off the court. How would you characterise his contribution to tennis?
Yeah, his impact stretched beyond tennis because he spoke out on social issues, particularly about equality within tennis. You know, he hired in 2014 Amelie Mauresmo as his coach, the first really big-time player to have a female coach, and spoke out about sexism in the game. He said, especially after Mauresmo was his coach, he just used to see how much people blamed her for his struggles. And he said, you know, if I had a male coach, it wouldn't be the same thing. He corrected reporters when they would say, so-and-so's the first player to do something. Say, wait a second, he's the first male player, not the first female player. Not the first female player. So making a distinction between male and female players, that they both deserve, you know, respect and recognition. So his impact definitely stretched behind the white lines on the tennis surface.
Sean Gregory, thanks very much.
Thank you.
Andy Murray played his first Wimbledon at the age of 18. Let's hope he gets to do one more before he retires. Get well, Andy. Now, before we go, most of us can relate to getting stuck in a traffic jam, but certainly not like the one we're going to show you. Look at this. This was a scene in South Africa's Kruger National Park as 4 large male lions strolled along the road. Look at them go. They look really cool as cucumbers there. Well, of course, the pictures gained international attention when they were posted on social media, and many safari goers got way more than they bargained for. Well, let's hope they make it in time and avoid the rush hour. And you can find more on all of the day's news and plenty of coverage on Andy Murray's retirement on our website. You can see what we're working on at any time. Find me on Twitter at BBC Rajini V. I'm Rajini Vaidyanathan. Thank you very much for watching us here at World News America. Have a wonderful weekend.